Absolutely. And it's a complex situation too, you know. And I know where Albo's hearts and lives on this as well. Like, he doesn't want to see this conflict continue.
It's also what's within all of our power.
Yeah. And I don't think they'll be never going to be.
I might kick it. It's 9 o'clock, so let's get it underway. Hansard ready? Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. We resume from yesterday the public hearing of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water for the inquiry into the transition to electric vehicles. Today the committee continues its hearing in Sydney. In accordance with the committee's resolution, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Those present here today are advised that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I now welcome witnesses from the Strata Community Association to give evidence today. Do we have them online, because they providing the evidence through a video link?
Yes, I am here.
Okay. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Mr. Joshua Samuel Baldwin, Strata Community Association, FCA, Australasian President.
Joshua, welcome to the hearing, and thanks for coming on. Are you by yourself, or do you have anyone else with you?
I do have Patrick Hughes.
Okay.
From the State National FCA office.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, just to go through a couple of more formalities, although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Joshua, I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to a discussion.
Thank you. The Strata Community Association would first like to thank the Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water for inviting us here today to participate as a part of its inquiry into the transition to electric vehicles. As stated in our submission, we are the peak industry body for body corporate and community title management, also known as strata management, in Australia and in New Zealand. It is important to note that FCA operates as both a national, for whom we are representing here today, as well as a part of a federated model where we are represented across each jurisdiction in Australia and New Zealand. So this affords us the distinct advantage to be able to engage with a vast array of strata stakeholders from all corners of the country, including suppliers, managers, owners, residents, state, local governments and so on. We've got about 5,000 individual and corporate members included in strata and body corporate managers, support staff, owners, representatives and suppliers of products and services to the industry. Across Australia, we know that at least 1 in 5 people are currently living in some form of strata type of property, with the estimate number of people living beyond 6 million people. Over the past few years, as the market presence of EVs has continued to grow in Australia, so too have the ongoing discussions surrounding the introduction of electric vehicles into strata. In short, the introduction of EVs and EV charging infrastructure into strata and community living presents some far more complex challenges than the introduction of EVs and EV charging into standalone homes. Importantly, whilst different state and territory governments are at various stages in their transitions towards both electrification and sustainable development of their built environment, we are confident that the issues relating to EVs and strata are being considered in the same fashion across almost all jurisdictions, resulting in various positive policy developments. Similarly, whilst strata is regulated at the state and territory level, we've also seen some positive developments nationally as well. Most notably would be the National Construction Code, the NCC. Regulations now require all Class 2 to 9 buildings that are built beyond October 2023 to be built with the electrical infrastructure required to accommodate EV charging. This signifies the recognition by the NCC that strata residents should be afforded the same luxuries as residents of standalone homes. However, the areas where SCA largely sees policy development stalling in this context is support for existing strata buildings. As you may be aware, strata buildings can range anywhere from a 4-lot, 2-storey walk-up built in the 1950s to an extremely complicated multi-building scheme with hundreds of lots. As a general rule, however, almost all of these older buildings in Australia have not been built with the level of electrical infrastructure sufficient to support the additional load that EV charging creates. Due to the nature of community living, different residents and owners have different interests that can somewhat be misaligned, which can often cause a friction and increase the difficulty of resolving the installation of the appropriate infrastructure to support EVs and EV charging. So not only that, but issues relating to costs, safety, appropriate insurance are among many other considerations that impact the ability for a strata resident to access the appropriate charging options at their own home, where the New South Wales government has now estimated 80 to 90% of EV owners will seek to charge. As strata managers, it is our job to guide, and an important part of our job to guide strata community residents and owners through this increasingly complex process. As such, stated in our submission, our objective is to increase the consideration of the unique characteristics of strata in policy formation in this context, and the creation of incentives that benefit the millions of Australians living in strata. We wish to highlight that if these concerns are not appropriately considered and addressed, it may be that the demand for EVs is therefore restricted for the 20% of Australians who live in strata currently. So thank you again for allowing us to speak today, and we're happy to answer any of your questions to the best of our knowledge.
Joshua, thank you for that opening statement. And does Patrick wish to add anything to that?
No, that's all from us, I think. So I can say and appreciate it.
Okay. Just for your benefit, I have with me on the committee today Dan Rapaccioli, who's from New South Wales, Zali Stegel from New South Wales, and Alison Byrne as well. We might be joined by the Deputy Chair, David Gillespie, at some stage, and also Mr Bert Van Manen from Queensland, but at this stage they are not here. With that, I'm going to just kick off with a couple of questions myself, and then we'll go into a general discussion. Firstly, the issue of, and I wasn't aware of this, so thanks for bringing it out in your own opening statement, that since October 23, there has been new requirements for, I guess, apartment owners with respect to ensuring that there's sufficient electric cable ability in each of the apartments. To your knowledge, is that being complied with and applied across Australia, or is it just specific to certain states?
So just to look back at that point, that's the National Construction Code. So that applies to any new development that is being built. That puts the onus on the builder and the developer to make that infrastructure available. Some stock is coming to market now all over Australia, which has been complied with, yes.
Okay. So, and I just want to be clear about this. You're not aware that any particular jurisdiction is lagging behind in complying with that regulation?
Not that I'm aware, because it's a national construction code.
Yep, no, I realise that. My understanding is that national construction codes are adopted by the respective jurisdictions and then enforced, etc. But sometimes there seems to be some inconsistency with which states are doing what and which local governments are doing things. But anyway,
Patrick, have you had any comments on that?
No, not to my knowledge. We do know that almost all jurisdictions across Australia have made comments on the new provisions of the NCC and generally supported and encouraged the developers within their jurisdiction to follow those provisions. So we have had acknowledgement from each jurisdiction. For the most part, I think that perhaps there's a couple that haven't, but there's broad support for that provision there by each jurisdiction.
Okay, and my other question is this: given that the number of electric vehicles has increased somewhat in Australia over the last couple of years, what kind of issues or concerns have been identified by yourself with respect to electric vehicle charging?
I guess I'll take it from day one
Yep.
in this industry.
Yep.
And just for the benefit of the committee, I am also a strata manager here in South Australia who manage complex buildings, and
Yep.
so I know firsthand and have some examples I'm happy to share.
Yep.
What usually happens is we're at an early adopter stage of EVs, and a lot of our stock in all over Australia
Yep.
is old and requires some type of addition to their infrastructure. Someone will buy an EV, come into the space, and then look to seek charging post purchase of EV. That puts a lot of pressure on the Strata Corporation and the committee to act in good faith. There's competing priorities. The person who's bought the charger needs to charge now. The committee and the Strata as a whole may look for a longer-term resolution, whilst the EV owner may want a PowerPoint right by their car, the Strata may look at rolling out infrastructure for availability for everyone. Then it comes down to the point of needing to go to a meeting for resolution, as the cost of this range from a PowerPoint connected to a corporate meter at $2,000 up to $20,000 per lot for a quite a robust and extreme load management system that will cater for the whole corporation. So when you've got one owner out of 20 who has an EV, you've got 19 other owners who some may support and some may reject, maybe due to the fact that a lot of comments that come out are, well, I don't have a petrol station at my strata, why can't I have that? Or I don't look at getting an EV. Or this is a investment for me and my tenants aren't interested in EV charging. There comes a real struggle internally with the corporation to actually get it off the ground. So that's kind of problem number one. Problem number two is obviously the cost. Some of these systems can be over $100,000 for 100 lots, for example, which also include demand of load that potentially the building doesn't have. So then we've got companies coming out proposing complex solutions that may not necessarily be the most appropriate for the corporation. We encourage corporations to undergo a load management review and feasibility study, obviously at an extra cost. We are somewhat worried about what happened in the solar industry some 20 years ago with cowboy installers coming out, fly-by-night companies, where they see an advantage to put large-scale, expensive infrastructure in, but don't have the longevity of a company, and they look at just moving in, making a quick buck and moving out. And so we are trying to encourage all of our strata managers to go down a feasibility study as well. They're the two biggest issues currently. The third issue is obviously the insurance issue. We are so in this early adopting stage that insurance companies haven't really come to a conclusion of what it looks like in their pricing model at this stage. So we have clients saying, if we put in all of this infrastructure, will the insurance company push up our premiums because we have EV charging? Well, we don't have an answer for that at this stage. The interesting part about the insurance, for the benefit of the committee, is it's a mandatory insurance. You have to have the insurance in a strata, and that is across all jurisdictions. It's not an optional. So anything that's done within the building must be disclosed to the strata insurer. And there is discussion that what happens down the line in 5 years' time, when the insurer then has evidence or heaven forbid, EV fires happen in stratas in Australia, and they start loading premiums as well.
Okay.
So that's probably the top 3 matters.
Yep. Joshua, thanks for that. That gives us a pretty good overview of the sort of issues we need to try and work through. But I'll hand over to some of my colleagues. Who wants to go first?
Hi, Zoe Stegel here. Just had a couple of questions. First, just picking up on that last comment, my understanding it's not EV cars that are really at risk of fires, it's more EV bikes and other devices. So, or have you got data that would suggest greater concern around EV vehicles causing fires?
No, not at all. And you're exactly right, member. In terms of the scooters and things like that, we are now seeing stratas move towards new bylaws restricting those types of vehicles being brought into stratas to combat that.
Yeah, because at the moment...
We have no evidence. We have no evidence of vehicles or anything like that in South Australia causing issue. We certainly look back and have spoken to industry experts, and it all comes down to the charging of the vehicle is the riskiest part. But if a proper system is installed by a regulated and compliant contractor, we see that risk almost eliminated. Going back to my previous comment about these cowboys and fly-by-nighters, that's what we worry about. Inferior infrastructure being installed in stratas causing compromise in the future.
Thanks. And I guess what I was really keen to understand, sorry, was there another comment? I couldn't hear. Oh, I think so. Okay, sorry.
I may make just an additional comment on that, sorry. From the data that we've seen, it actually may suggest that traditional EVs may be even less prone to combustion than traditional ICE vehicles. But the danger being that if an EV were to be involved in a fire event, it's significantly more harmful than what a traditional ICE fire might look like. They're incredibly hard to put out. There's issues with like direct flame expulsion, what's called a thermal runaway, which causes an inferno fire. It's not necessarily that they're more prone to fire. They actually may be less so than a traditional vehicle, and certainly LEVs are the thing to think about in that regard. But if they were to be involved in a fire event, the fire event is significantly harmful.
Thanks. What work are you doing? I mean, obviously, a big question that comes out around strata is also for residents to have access to, for example, rooftop solar and renewables, or cheaper energy options and more energy efficiency within stratas. And that is, combined with that, maybe the making available charging for EVs. What maybe work or development is happening around combining? Because once you combine, for example, rooftop solar for a strata where all residents clearly, or if it's owner-occupied, will get a benefit. If it's tenanted, I appreciate that's a whole nother difficulty of how the benefit is shared, from a landlord to a tenant. But then that coupled, obviously, with charging capacity. Is there progress or development around those kind of models that try and bring multiple benefits?
Yeah, absolutely, member, and I love that I'm actually able to speak to this. Just for the record, 2 to 20 Hertel Square in Adelaide. Over the past 5 years, that group has looked at sustainability initiatives. One of which is a shared solar initiative using a system called SolShare. They have a hugely significant solar array on the top of their roof. They were able to pay for that using other sustainable measures, such as looking at their waste removal, coupled with some other minor initiatives. The SolShare system allows for the 27 owners to each have a 6.6 kilowatt system is a virtual system attached to the back of their meter. So effectively, you now have 27 apartment owners that have their own solar system that is equivalent to most standalone homes. As a part of that project, they're looking at further sustainability in terms of battery storage and EVs. It's kind of a embedded network that they've created on top of themselves. It was hard, it was difficult, because it was retrospective installation of electrical infrastructure, and it had challenges certainly with the state regulator being SA Power Networks, because it was something that hadn't been seen before. But what they're looking at is attaching EV chargers to their own meters using a load management system to be able to use the solar power that they're generating to charge their EVs. Now that's a unique but expensive exercise that retrospective installations will always face. Looking forward into new developments, embedded networks are quite an attractive option for stratas if they are maintained correctly and held by the actual strata or community title. So in terms when these new buildings are being built, you have developers looking at that and installing major solar arrays and panels that can support EV charging as well as battery storage for individual owners.
Okay. And so, with that, obviously for any new builds, there's opportunity. You're starting from scratch. So there's first of all obviously the changes to the National Construction Code, but obviously there's that opportunity to think in a holistic way of the whole model. But in terms of the retrofit, obviously that is where the challenge is for the amount of stock that requires retrofitting. Are you aware of any other technology that maybe simplifies? I'm trying to find the name. I have had a few come to me. Technologies that assist with charging being able to be enabled from more, traditional power points. That's not fast charging, but that assists in, managing the load. Are you aware of other technologies that can be done other than having to lay whole new high power systems, which I understand are very expensive?
Yeah, and so we're talking about a level 2 charger versus a level 1 charger, and that's one of the misnomers of the industry, where you have a company selling something that doesn't necessarily be needed in the strata in itself, as in these cars are parked for 8 hours a night. They don't need to be charged within 2 hours because they're there and they can be trickle charged like most standalone homes as well. The issue is obviously the load management, and you require a load management system. And once you start requiring a load management system, the companies will start pushing level 2 chargers. The only reason they push level 2 chargers is because you do need to quickly charge the vehicle so it can move on to the next vehicle, and load charge throughout the evening and priority charge. But certainly if the infrastructure allows, power points in individual car parks can be done, but it still requires cabling back to a meter somewhere. A lot of these meters in what we call strata schemes, so I call them strata schemes in South Australia, so it's stacked apartments, is sometimes those meters are on level 4 rather than being on ground level. So it's a long cable run, so they end up getting put into a common power source, and then it's metering that's required to make sure it's equitable for the entire corporation. So certainly level 1 power points in car parks is the first absolute option, but it still will require some type of load management in the future.
So what kind of, regulatory direction, I'm hearing the technical and the financial kind of, constraints, but what would you want to see us as a committee make in terms of recommendations, in terms of regulatory changes that could assist some of this, or is it purely looking at financial support like grants from government to assist stratas in making these retrofits?
It's probably a 2-prong approach. One is the voting thresholds are quite high across the country. So in New South Wales, it's a 50% majority before we can progress anything. In South Australia, it's a 75% special resolution, for example, so it can be quite difficult in terms of actually getting a motion passed to start allowing EV charging. And in some jurisdictions, and again, Patrick might need to help me with this, there is some jurisdictions that don't allow you to block a sustainability initiative, whereas, as example, in South Australia, you could block that even if it's because it's 75% needed, majority needed, sorry. So that's one form of that. The other is, I guess it comes back down to a feasibility study. The thing with stratas and strata managers is they're not electrical engineers, and a committee may be built of, you may be very lucky that you have a committee member who is inclined to electrical engineering or something like that, but you could have a committee of a teacher, a nurse and an office worker of some description making decisions on complex matters. And so having a feasibility study done, whether it's regulated or supported by government, would be beneficial.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I live in Strata as well, and we're currently having the debate about electric vehicles. Our building's about 4 or 5 years old. They've got concerns about the load management. They're looking at that, and also insurance, what that's going to mean in the future, as you mentioned previously. But you also mentioned the inferior infrastructure, the fly-by-nighters, the sharks out there in the system. What can we do to stop that? Is that through state or federal? Where do you think that might be the most appropriate way to fix some of that, to start to get some of these misconceptions or real risks, actually, if people aren't installing the proper equipment properly? Where do we go from there to stop that?
I think it comes back to the feasibility study that's done. Anybody who has an electrical licence can go ahead and install an EV system from a PowerPoint up to a level 2 charger, and potentially a level 3 charger. So we're worried that you have contractors out there who see this as an added benefit.
So do you think there should
sometimes we use the analogy.
Should there be a specific qualification? Is that what you're saying we need to possibly look at?
Yeah, a qualification potentially, yes, and or the requirement for the contractor to follow some type of feasibility study that has a professional that's come out and said this is the design that needs to be followed. Unfortunately, we've got, I use the analogy that sometimes strata can be looked at like a wedding at a function centre.
Yep.
And when in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, people look at a strata and go, there's a lot of money to be made here, whereas these owners should be treated the same as any person in any standalone home.
Yeah.
I may also add, there's potential perhaps for some sort of different jurisdiction, a centralised list of be able to go onto a website and say this is the trusted service provider they've read the government. We've seen similar systems like this with flooding rectification, for example, in our industry. I think a lot of the time strata just don't know where to go or who to trust. So perhaps a directory on a website.
So like a registration process, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yep.
Alison, are you good?
Yep.
Dan, did you have?
Yep. G'day, guys. How are we? Just wondering what the people in the units feel about this. So the tenants, have you had discussions with them? Because some of them, I would imagine, would want it and some wouldn't want it.
Yeah, and it is mixed as well. Certainly, you mentioned the word tenants as well, rather than owner-occupiers, and that adds an extra level of complexity, especially when a tenant in a property purchases an EV and they don't actually have any direct contact or context into the strata committee themselves. be it only through the owner to which or their landlord, for the use of a better term. So that's an even more complicated level when you've got a tenant who has a EV and then has no way of actually having the discussion with the committee about installing infrastructure. They rely solely upon the landlord, who in some cases looks at the strata only through an investment lens and says, how am I going to ROI on a levy of, up to $5,000 to install infrastructure for my one tenant? So it is an extra level of scrutiny that is applied as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. And in the strata complexes that you manage currently, what is the feeling here? Do they want them or do they not want them?
It changes from building to building. Certainly, the larger the number of people involved, we find, as in the more lots, we find it becoming very disconnected because for instance, if you've got a group of 100 and they're voting on a paper towards putting EV infrastructure in, some are so disconnected that they just look at the number and say no. Whereas if you've got a group of, say, 10, it's likely that all those 10 people are going to be in a room having a discussion. So it's really the town hall metric, essentially, of how that gets run. It's probably 50-50 at the moment because we are moving out of that early adopter stage of EVs and moving into that more mainstream. People are now making that decision. 3 years ago, we talked about they would go, or maybe I'll get the EV for my next vehicle. But people are actually making the decision now, well, I have to upgrade my vehicle, I need an EV, or I want an EV, essentially. And so we're now moving into the more pressurised system where we are starting to move to a higher proportion of the people who have EVs, which is making it a little bit easier, but not totally easier. You certainly have the people who I have not been to a meeting yet, and I've probably had over 100 meetings about EVs with my strata clients, and every meeting somebody always says, well, I want to have an unleaded petrol Bowser in the middle of my car park as well. And that seems to be the biggest contention point. Why does this person get to fill up their vehicle right in their car park, but I have to drive 3 minutes down the road to the local Mobil or BP? And so that's the biggest contention there. And then there is the fear-mongering.
That's just them being sooks, though, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Like, you can't have a petrol station in your place. Like, that's just not practical. Like, exactly. That's a terrible, terrible argument that they're trying to have there.
But it happens a lot, unfortunately. Yeah. The other one is the fear-mongering around EV fires. And again, there was a report that just got released, I think 2 days ago, that the committee may have received from EV Fire Safe. It was a global report from 2010 up until 2023, Patrick, is that correct? Where it talked about the global fires and incidents with EVs. Very small proportionate was in the built environment. A lot was kind of road impact, other fire impact, etc. There is a lot of, I guess, concern from the fire services because it is an operational issue to extinguish an EV fire if it may well happen. But from our understanding, there are products on market now that are available to fire services that would combat that type of argument. I just don't think it can be a blanket, we are not allowing any EV in an underground car park.
I would just add to that, Josh, sorry. We've had some concerns with the stakeholders we've discussed as well. Josh talked about some of the capitalism coming in and taking advantage of the situation. We've also heard that there's some products on market that are advertised as being able to combat EV fires more effectively than traditional fire suppression methods. And from some of the more fire safety inclined experts we talked to, a lot of these products are basically junk, for lack of a better word, aren't necessarily better or worse than combating EV fires. And this is in terms of like personal retail products that might be available. Certainly there's something to be said about fire services having the appropriate equipment and training mechanisms to be able to extinguish a fire when it happens. But, we know that they're not very common, so at least in strata at the moment. So, yeah, just wanted to make that point as well.
Thank you.
I'll go to Dr. Gillespie, the Deputy Chair of the committee. David?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. You mentioned that in your notes that some insurances for the stratas would change if they had EV infrastructure or EV cars. Could you clarify if it's the charging or having EV cars changes the insurance? And
Sorry,
what sort of
the start of your question broke up. Sorry.
Oh yeah, just you mentioned that stratas who pay the insurance for the block of units, their insurance premiums can go up if they have got EV charging. I just seeking clarification of that, as well as whether premiums go up just by storing EV cars in strata insured properties.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Whilst I'm not aware of in premiums being impacted now, there certainly is discussion about people alleging that premiums have been impacted now, but there's a lot of factors that are contributing to premium rise currently in 23-24. There is a duty of disclosure for the corporation to ensure that they are properly insured, and if they go ahead and install additional infrastructure, they will have to tell the insurer that that infrastructure has been installed. Currently, we do not have to disclose, nor I believe anyone is disclosing what type of vehicle is parked in the corporation at the present time. Whether or not the insurers may well change and start asking that question for their underwriting, we're not sure at this present time.
I'll just Josh. We have had the question of people are a little bit confused about what their disclosure requirements are at this stage. It's not explicitly being stated by insurers, as far as I'm aware. So it's like Josh says, it's they purchase an EV and then they're required to disclose that to the insurer. Does that increase the whole building? They're not. There's a bit of confusion in that space. I have had some discussions with insurers, and some of the risk factors they've outlined is potentially that could impact the premiums in the future. So fire, obviously, electrical shock involved with the high voltages required to charge the vehicles, theft. If you're talking about a mixed-use strata, so that's a strata that has both commercial and residential lots in the same building, the potential for business interruption, personal injury. So those are some of the risk factors that insurers may be considering. But again, it's early stages, and from what we understand, they haven't quite packed in yet.
Thanks very much.
Josh, can I just go to this question? In the Scandinavian countries, where there's also a lot of apartments and the like, and there's also a lot more electric vehicles, do you have any information about the experience of those countries with dealing with basically the strata associations issues that you've just been briefing the committee on over the last half hour? I mean, how have they managed all these issues?
I don't have any information on that. Patrick, do you?
I don't have it on the Scandinavian that they've a bit more effective. But I do think there is the point to be made. Look at not just examples from Australia, but jurisdictions around the world at how they've successfully implemented EVs and EV charging into apartments. But no, I don't have any specific information on Scandinavian. Unfortunately.
I just use them because they seem to be the countries that have the highest number of electric vehicles. So, but yeah.
So could I ask, sorry, Zali again, for example, in places like Paris and like London, like big cities that have low emission kind of, I guess, standards in their inner city, and I know in Paris in particular, they've got quite a big rollout of, your parking meter is also a charging point. So where you park on the street, they've got a lot less maybe in-building car park. Is there research or, I guess, view from the Strata Community Association around, obviously, a benefit to Strata? Everyone doesn't have a standalone vehicle, house where they can essentially decide on their charging capacity themselves. Is there a view around a greater community charging access, obviously from local governments around council car parks to street parking? Has the association looked at that?
Look, certainly have, and that in on ground is kind of the response currently. It is locating community charging, whether it's supplied by an RAA or NRMA or something like that, or the City of Sydney or City of Adelaide, etc. Because they are quite close. We know that a lot of this high-rise, dense living is happening in the CBDs where there is extensive charging networks that are being rolled out. Absolutely, it does come back to what's fair to the individual strata owner, and should they be prejudiced just because they live in the CBD versus somebody in a standalone home as well. And so that does constantly come up. Moving forward as well, there is a change, especially in Brisbane and Queensland with developers at the moment, increasingly installing community vehicles, which are EV, connected to what I spoke about before, those embedded networks. And so there is a move by developers to reduce the amount of car parks available in the development, and some units are being sold with no car parks, for example, or car parks as an added benefit, but then having these community vehicles available, 1, 2, 3 or 4 that they can check out and drive and then return back to the point of origin and then be charging their EVs, their Teslas or Kia EV6s or something like that. And so there is a move towards that. So you might have a building of 50 with only 15 car parks that may only be allocated to those, penthouse apartments, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from the committee members? Josh and Patrick, we've just about run out of time. Is there anything else that you want to raise with the committee in the couple of minutes we have left?
Nothing from me, no.
Nothing from me as well. I think we've covered broad section quite well.
Okay, well, I thank you both for your attendance or your presentation to the committee today. I don't think you've been asked to provide any additional information, but if anything comes up from the discussion that we've had today that you want to add to any of the answers, please do so by the 9th of August if you can. And you will also be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to the committee. If you feel you need to make any adjustments to that evidence, then again, please let the Secretariat know. With that, I thank you both for your assistance with the inquiry that we're currently undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
We've got IKEA. They're just coming in.
They're just coming in?
Just
Okay.
video.
My wife loves IKEA, but I bloody hate it. Because she buys it, I put it together. It's a very emotional time. Morning, how are
Good
you?
morning.
My wife thinks you guys are the best.
IKEA.
She loves IKEA. I loathe yours because I got to put it together.
Okay.
It is easy. It's good. You guys do.
You ready to go?
Good to go.
Good. I now welcome witnesses from IKEA to give evidence to the committee. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? Whoever wants to go first.
Okay. Lauren Sinfield, and I'm Public Affairs Leader for IKEA Australia.
Thank you.
Alexandra Kelly, Zero Emission Delivery Lead.
Thank you. Although the committee doesn't require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing of proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you both, or just one of you, depending on how you want to do this, to make a brief opening statement, and then we'll proceed to a discussion.
Cool, thank you. Good morning, Chair and members of the House Standing Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today into the inquiry into transition to electric vehicles. Thanks for the introduction. I work at IKEA Australia's Zero Emission Delivery Lead and previously worked at the Electric Vehicle Council as a policy manager. With me today is Lauren, our Public Affairs Leader. IKEA is a global home furnishing retailer and a values-driven business with a vision to create a better everyday life for the many people. This vision extends beyond home furnishings and in the way we conduct our business. As a company, we want to have a positive impact on people, society and the planet. We believe that we have a responsibility to lead by example, with sustainability at the core of our decision making and advocacy and learning sharing a key enabler of industry change. The IKEA brand is made up of many companies. Inter IKEA is responsible for the range, brand and supply chain globally. IKEA Retail operates as franchisees. IKEA Australia is one of these franchisees. Our representation today is made in reference to last mile delivery on behalf of IKEA Australia. Specifically, that is the delivery of products from our 10 IKEA stores and 3 distribution centres to our customers' homes across the country. This movement of goods is serviced by road freight vehicles, which is the focus of our submission in this inquiry. By 2025, IKEA has the ambition to fulfil 100% zero-emission home deliveries for our customers. This is a global target, and this is a goal that we cannot achieve alone. It requires collaboration and buy-in from many stakeholders in a complex web of the delivery ecosystem. We are the end user of this ecosystem. To explain, IKEA does not own its delivery fleet. We work with transport partners, including All Purpose Transport, ANC Delivers, and King's Capital, to implement home deliveries with electric vehicles across Australia. We choose to work with partners that help us realise our sustainability ambition. However, these vehicles are not owned by our delivery partners. Rather, they are owned by small, medium family businesses, often subcontractors or owner-operators. So our level of influence can be limited and a key challenge. And this is where our 100% zero-emission delivery target comes in. It provides a guiding light for us all to work towards. There are, however, other challenges identified in recent years. The first being charging infrastructure accessibility. Commercial vehicles don't fit in car bays in the public network and garages that subcontractors have at their homes, and there is no on-street charging options for commercial vehicles. Secondly, model availability and cost. About 80% of our order volume can be completed with zero-emission vehicles, commercial ones, that are available in the market today. The challenge is the cost. They are more expensive. And new technology, so drivers want to test them, trial them before they buy them. Vans are often missing from the policy conversation, but at the moment fulfil about 60% of the zero-emission vehicles we have in our fleet. Thirdly are the regulatory implications. Payload impacts due to battery weight, steer axle mass and licensing requirements. Nevertheless, we pursue our ambition with success. In July 2022, we delivered 5.38% of total orders in a zero-emission vehicle. In July 2024, that number has increased to 42% of our orders being delivered in a zero-emission vehicle. This puts us 14th out of a total 30 IKEA countries. Leading markets for IKEA are India, China and Finland. This speaks to the broad opportunity that we have to accelerate in Australia. Currently, we have 55 electric vans and trucks operating for us nationally, and in 2022, we trialled electric tuk-tuks for the first time. To further support our journey to zero emission delivery, we have an investment of $4.5 million to install charging infrastructure in our stores and distribution centres dedicated to our delivery service. So that's for our delivery partners and their drivers. By moving early, we are encouraging our delivery partners and their drivers to work with the technology and make mistakes, learn from them, build and grow their experience with us, and optimise the delivery service for our customers. And we're very happy to share our learnings on our journey so far.
Alexandra, thank you very much for that. Lauren, did you wish to add anything to that?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Alexandra, can I just clarify, the 42% by 2024 of orders delivered by EV vehicles, that's across the world?
That's in Australia.
Just in Australia?
Yeah, so that's a 42% in Australia. Globally, I'm not sure, I'll have to take that on notice, what we're achieving as a company globally, but Australia, we're at 42%.
Actually, it'd be interesting to know how that compares with your global figure.
So India and China, Finland are at the top of the pack, so they're the top three. So they'd be above 42%, but what they are, I'm not sure exactly yet.
How long have you been going for that? Like 42%, is that like you've been trying for 1 year, 2 years?
The target came in 2018 is when we set the target, but about 2022 is when you could see the company really make an investment by putting a dedicated resource into each country. So my role was created in 2022, and there's now a zero emission delivery project implementation manager in each market with a specific goal or ambition to get us to our transition journey.
And is it the case where to get to that 42% would have been, and I'm not saying easy, but relatively easy, but now it gets much more difficult to maintain what if you were looking at a graph, a straight line increment?
Probably the first 10% was the most challenging, and when we set the target, there were not many vehicles available in the market.
Yep.
But in the last 18 months, we've seen a lot more electric van and light-duty trucks come into the Australian market. So we've seen an accelerated growth. What has happened is it's been the lighter end of the vehicle spectrum. So we obviously do have medium-duty trucks that need replacing in the delivery partners, and we're starting to see that vehicle type now come into the market as well. So as passenger vehicles kind of came and then bigger SUV ones came, we're seeing the vans, the trucks come, and then the medium duties will come. And so they're starting to be adopted by the delivery partners as well.
And that's as they retire, you replace them?
Yes, so, it's the subcontractors that own them, which is the challenge. So working for the IKEA account, they obviously are quite aware of the target. And so when our delivery partners recruit, they're recruiting drivers that are willing to go EV or know that they have to go EV. And so that's how I'm kind of seeing that change and change management happening at a subcontractor level. There are also financing options, so you don't necessarily need to buy. There are companies that do vehicle leasing. There's not many of them, and as a subcontract, I think the challenge is that a lot of leasing options are for fleets, but again, they're individually owned vehicles or they're small, medium businesses. Now, that's not to speak for the whole industry. Obviously, there are big companies, delivery companies that do own their vehicles. It's just the majority, and certainly for us, our truck flow, it's all owner-operated, driver, subcontractor owned.
So that 42% is going to keep increasing, you think?
Yeah. By next August is the target, so we have our eyes set on that, and with the vehicles available in the market today, we can achieve at least 80% of order volume. And so we know that in the next 6 months we're getting some bigger trucks with bigger batteries, and so once those hit the market, we'll obviously put them into the fleet with our delivery partners, and that will start to service some of those near regional areas.
Does IKEA offer any incentive to the vehicle owners to transition to an electric vehicle?
We don't currently do anything with a subsidy or an incentive, but we have one delivery cost with the delivery partner. So we don't pay an EV delivery and a diesel delivery. It's part of the full package. So it's bundled up in there, and how they hire their drivers and what they pay them is out of the scope of our knowledge, really.
Okay. All right, I'll go to David.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering, the e-tuk-tuk, is that just like a little, I'm familiar with tuk-tuks, is it just for in the campus of the IKEA store, or do you go out in that 10-kilometre radius?
So the trial was in 2022, it was for 3 months, and it delivered from our Tempe store, down to Bondi, South Sydney, Western Sydney.
So have they got a little single wheel at the front?
Yeah, they're three-wheel electric tuk-tuks. Yeah. They were obviously well loved by customers. They're also a good delivery vehicle, micromobility solution, because they're easy to park and that kind of thing. The challenges we had were the box size. So obviously sometimes you can't fit an IKEA product in the back of a tuk-tuk, but just the build quality. So we're looking at what Pilot 2 looks like. It wasn't the electrical components of the tuk-tuk that we called it a successful failure, basically. It was the electric part worked, the tuk-tuk part worked to some degree, but then a few of the mechanical components weren't quite up to quality.
So are you doing another one? When's that one?
We're scoping it. We don't know when or how it will happen, but we're keen to pursue micromobility as a solution into the future. It's just about making sure we've got the right vehicle this time, and to use the learnings from the first trial as to, you know, do we go as far as we did the first time? Do we pull it back a bit? And that kind of thing.
Because certainly for parking within the city, it would be, really helpful.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
You're not partnering with like Australia Post with all their small delivery to be electric. Like, you could think of a lot of other companies with small, urban delivery that would be benefiting from small electric tuk-tuk.
Yeah, you want to say that?
Not yet, but we're looking at that.
I guess there's kind of two parts to the delivery service. One we call parcel, which is smaller orders, and that's a national network like AusPost and TGE. It's actually much harder for us to control the vehicle types because obviously we're feeding into their network, whereas what we're talking about, the last mile home delivery component, is the truck flow. And so we have dedicated vehicles operating for us, and we have much more influence over that because obviously the vehicles are loaded with only IKEA product. So we can have that KPI built in much stronger with them. With National Network Solutions, we're one of maybe 20 different companies that are on that truck. And so the share of zero emission delivery as a result of that vehicle type is going to be lower, but our level of influence is also lower. So we're focusing at the moment on the truck flow, which is a big percentage of the orders. Yeah.
The 55 electric vehicles you guys have working for you guys now,
Yeah.
you want that to be 100% of your fleet by some stage?
So 55 vehicles currently operating, which give us 42% of our truck flow. And by next August, the target and ambition is to have 100%. So we will need, at least another 60 to 70 vehicles by then.
Yep, no worries. And that's from a contractor. Do you just use a single contractor, or do you guys use a whole heap of different
So we have 3 delivery partners, ANC, APT and King's Capital. They hire, whether they're owner drivers or subcontractors, they're kind of the layer with... We've actually got some diagrams. Can we hand?
Yeah.
It's quite complicated to explain, so we've got a picture. The challenge for us, right, is that we don't own the vehicles and we don't hire the drivers. We hire the delivery companies as the experts to do the delivery service. So the impact and what we can have on a subcontractor is quite limited, but we build into the KPIs with the delivery partners the target.
Yep.
And then as they recruit drivers in...
So they're only recruiting people with electric vehicles, really, to do this?
Or they're looking at their existing drivers and saying who's willing to go electric. They've now got good use cases where people are more committed, they can see that the technology works. And so there's a lot of buy-in. The first movers have kind of really helped shift the mentality within the delivery partners and the existing subcontractors to make the change. And then as they recruit in, my understanding, without speaking on behalf of them, is that they're recruiting in drivers to get zero emissions vehicles. I can't remember what page it's on. In the paperwork there, so there's a page subcontractor model, so it doesn't have any things on it. We're trying to explain, I guess, we're the retailer. The level of influence really is about how we move these red boxes. And the key thing for us has been the target, because it gives us all a focal point.
So obviously you've done a little bit of research already. You got the 42%. You want to be at 100% by next year. Mm-hmm. Where are you tracking right now? Because obviously you would keep an eye on it.
So we are at 42% now. It was 43 yesterday, so we are going up. It's just, we're hoping to get pretty close to that goal.
Yeah, so the ambition is to get as close as possible by our end of financial year, which is the 31st of August. But when IKEA set this goal in 2018 globally, they knew it was a big ambition and that we don't have all the answers, but to take a leadership position early on the topic and to mobilise others, as we have with our transport partners here in Australia, to take action. And as you can see, that shift has happened in quite a short amount of time.
And you guys have got huge warehouses. What are they? Are you guys using EVs in those warehouses, and also for your company cars? For your delivery, you want them to be 100% EVs in the market. What about for all of your other vehicles that you have?
We don't have any fleet vehicles.
Oh, none.
No.
Okay, so managers don't have vehicles through IKEA. Okay.
No fleet vehicles.
Yep.
You don't do flat pack cars?
No flat pack cars. Maybe a trip talk in the future.
We do a flat pack boot.
Please don't tell my wife.
Flat pack boot organizer. Flat pack boot organizer. No, yeah, we don't have fleet vehicles. In the warehouses, I actually don't know enough about that, so I'll have to take it on notice. We have electric forklifts and that kind of thing. I think that's just the application used in warehousing now, but we can take that on notice and get some more info for you.
Okay, thank you. And is IKEA looking at trying to get other parts of the delivery chain electric too? Because obviously a lot of it comes from overseas to us and goes all over the world. How are they tracking in that area?
So that's the Inter IKEA company and completely separate from IKEA Retail. So I can't really speak to what they do as a company. I'm not across their targets or goals in that regard. So the supply chain from manufacture to port is managed completely by Inter IKEA, and we're from distribution centre to the customer's home, so that last mile component.
Okay, thank you.
But IKEA has overall targets of net zero and
Yes.
emissions reduction. So they, I think, head office is looking at all aspects of the IKEA
All aspects.
business. Yeah.
That's correct. But for us to speak on the topic, it's Inter IKEA is a separate company, and we're a franchise under the retail side of the business. But yeah, absolutely, Zali.
How are you going to, like, obviously for customers? I was interested to hear that you're saying at your distribution centres you're looking at providing charges, so that, I mean, that question that commercial vehicle charging is difficult, too large for standard parking areas. And so I must say, a few years ago, I had, as a campaign, I had a bus, an electric bus, and we had great difficulty in finding locations where we could charge it, because it's not part of public transport. Traditional charging doesn't. And so I can absolutely sympathise with that challenge. So that's really interesting. You're looking at installing charging to be available at your distribution centres. Would that charging also be available more broadly, or just distribution for your products?
So we've got dedicated infrastructure as part of the 4.5 million going in for delivery, but we do already have charging for customers in about 8 of the 10 stores anyway. So there's 4 chargers at each store available for customers.
But that's
for
charging
passenger-
again that's fitted only for passenger cars.
Yes. Oh, sorry, you mean the new chargers, would they be open?
Yeah.
No, they would stay dedicated delivery for the time being. And I mean, I'm sure there's opportunity to explore. IKEA loves to innovate, loves to understand, how we can help community and that kind of thing. But in the first instance, given the gap in the public network for delivery vehicles, they would be prioritised.
Yeah, because that is the.
Yeah.
And have you got any more maybe feedback that we could benefit from your subcontractors around the challenges they face for that kind of small commercial vehicle charging opportunity? Like, where are they?
So the way we see it is there are kind of a few different options. You've obviously got people that don't have garages or off-street parking, so you need some kind of public hub solution. Some might park in commercial car parks where they rent space depending on the vehicle size, so that's an opportunity. I think in warehousing areas, hubs will become more prevalent as they have in international markets. Germany's got quite good examples of hub-based solutions in metro areas, but
So can you just explain that a bit? So in sort of industrial areas where there's a significant proportion of small to medium distribution needs, they've provided.
there's kind of hub. It's almost like a car park with charging, and you can subscribe to the car park and then use the charging. The challenge being that because the batteries are bigger, you need a longer charge, and a fast charge is not necessarily the right use case. So having somewhere you can park for 4 or 5 hours and you kind of meter yourself in and then come back and pick it up means a lot of people in the subcontractor market could access infrastructure that's close to where they're either doing their job or where they live. I think the other thing that's a challenge is we've had a few companies ask us, would we be interested in committing to that kind of subscription model charging, but we obviously don't own the vehicles. We don't know who we're going to work with all the time. And so we're not the right people to commit to that kind of investment, which is why we've gone with our own infrastructure solution. And it's also because then we understand a little bit more the charging cycles and the need more directly. So we're installing 22 kilowatt chargers, so an overnight charge. We've got 20 kilowatt chargers going in to support. Some trucks don't have AC charging capability, so that those will support that. And then we've got a couple of fast chargers going in at each unit to either act as the contingency charger or the top up during the day so that we can do a second route. So having different types of chargers in each store means that we're not limiting how we're using the vehicles and the opportunity. We're also not controlling it, right? They'll just be available and our drivers will come and use them as they need, guided with the delivery partners who have a key role and influence and are optimising how those vehicles are used and how chargers are used and that kind of thing.
With respect to the charging stations and just looking at the photo that's in this material that you've given us, firstly, I assume you charge the vehicles for the charging? They pay for charging?
Yes, so there is a cost on our charges for customers and the delivery vehicles, yeah.
I don't really know, but is that charging station with the truck on it where the truck also gets loaded, or is it a separate charging bay?
So is this the picture we're talking about?
Yeah, the van.
Yeah. So that is a 22 kilowatt charger. That vehicle parks there. It doesn't load there.
It doesn't load there.
No.
And this is just a thought, but the possibility of having charges at the point where the vehicles are loading, would that not make it more time efficient if you had fast charging, that whilst the vehicle is there loading, it's also charging? Has that been considered?
Certainly it has been considered. The way we have gone with phase one is we don't know all the answers at the moment, and we know that the fast charging is more expensive. So that's one consideration. Two, it would require a lot of efficiencies to try and get vehicles on, loaded and off in the right amount of time to make that model work. And I don't know that we're experts enough in that yet to kind of commit to that. And then we don't want to see a knock-on effect to our customers, right, who have expectations about delivery times and that kind of thing. Now, that's not to say in the future that kind of solution isn't being considered, and certainly they do it in other IKEA markets. It's just in Australia we didn't see it as the right use case as the starting point.
Okay. Based on what IKEA is doing, are you aware of any other companies that are doing a similar, I guess, or have a similar strategy for what they do with their deliveries?
I know that Woolworths has a goal by 2030. I'm not sure what the goal is. Don't want to get it wrong for them. Yeah. But they have come out with a goal recently. And listen, we do know that it's starting to become more important. Certainly our delivery partners obviously have moved first on this, and so there's an opportunity for them to kind of become experts in the market, and they feed back to us that it is becoming a question that's asked more often. And I would encourage you to speak with some of our delivery partners. I'm happy to kind of send some emails too, but they've got really interesting journeys, and they're obviously the ones that are overcoming a lot of the challenge as well. And they are the ones that do a lot of the change making with the owner operators and their subcontractors. But it's been a really collaborative process. Transparency with them, transparency with us. You know, today this vehicle's off the road because of X, or this vehicle's going off the road forever because of the battery, or these kinds of things. That obviously all is an ongoing conversation and impacts goals. So we keep it pretty open with them.
With your delivery partners, do you know whether they have had a cost saving from going to EVs versus their traditional vehicles they were using?
I'm not sure. You'd have to probably ask them directly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. David?
Your site at Tempe, which I've shopped at, is massive. Is it plastered in solar panels or anything like that?
Yeah, there's around 3,000 on the roof.
Right.
3,200.
So does that power your shed, like
A percentage of, yeah,
a percentage?
of the retail operations.
Do you know how much?
No, I'd have to take that on notice off the top of my head.
Yeah. And does that get linked to any car charges while people are... Have you got them on site?
We have the electric vehicle charges for customers, yes, but it's, as I understand it, it's not directly linked. It's to retail operations is how we typically talk about it.
It's not metered separately, so it's kind of generate in, and then where it's used, it's used.
Okay. Thanks.
So are we finishing? Or
No. Yesterday we were given some figures on the cost difference between combustion engine heavy trucks and the electric vehicles. The vehicles used by IKEA appear to be what I call lighter light trucks. Do you have any, and I know that you don't supply the vehicles generally, but do you have any idea of the cost difference between an electric vehicle and a petrol or diesel vehicle that the other drivers are using? So in other words, if one of your drivers wants to convert, what sort of difference in money is it?
It's about 30 to 50%, depending on the vehicle. There's different. Some of the challenges are that drivers are loyal to brands. I mean, it's their kind of transport vehicle, right? So they are waiting for either the brands that they know and love to switch, or they're trying new brands. And we are seeing new brands come in from Asia, and they are on the cheaper end. So they do make up more of our market share in terms of vehicles. But the difference we've found is light duty trucks about 120 to can be up to 480,000 for light duty, and that's up to 16 ton. The challenge also being that it's not a one size fits all kind of package. Obviously, when you buy a truck, you need to consider how far is this truck going to go, and therefore do I need one battery pack or two battery packs, and I'm going to put a box on the truck. What kind of box am I going to put on the truck? So trucks don't come ready-made. You spec them out as the user, and we're not doing that, but our delivery partners are. So you buy a chassis, and then you say, okay, I want to drive 150 kilometers. I need X amount of kilowatt hours to enable me to do that. That weight is going to reduce my payload, so I need to put this type of box on, and so it becomes very complex. But the scale for light duty trucks is 120 to about 480. Vans, they have come down a bit. There are some in the market now for, I think, between 80 and 120.
Okay. All right. So any other questions from?
So I had a question, Chair. In your you put it on your final page, government facilitate transition through targeted zero emission truck policy. Do you want to maybe expand a bit more on what would you be wanting to see from government around this? Because we've seen now the fuel efficiency standard that categorises vehicles.
Yes.
It had a lot of exceptions for larger size vehicles, which I think will fail to incentivise more fuel efficient or electric vehicle models coming in when it comes to that industrial or transport use. And then you're saying around the heavier trucks, what would you be looking for there?
So I think there's probably three policy levers the government can use: regulatory, and I know that the Nat Road spoke a little bit on things like steer axle mass and payload exemptions. Now they're pretty prevalent in European markets. So if you're using an EV, then you get a 1 ton payload exemption to account for the battery. So you're not losing anything by having the EV. That's kind of a regulatory lever that could be pulled. Steer axle mass, I'm not going to get into it, it's a bit too technical for me, but certainly I know that does have an impact, and the lack of cohesiveness of that across the states and different vehicles is having an impact on their uptake. Charging infrastructure, I really think a build it and they will come model needs to start emerging in the public domain for vans and light duty trucks, because at the moment if you've got owner operators that don't have access to infrastructure at home, they can't make the decision to go electric because they have nowhere to charge. So their decision becomes based not around having a vehicle that's suitable, but actually having the means to refuel that vehicle. So a dedicated network.
Excuse my ignorance on this, but so for example, I know for passenger vehicles, there's quite the network now in terms of charging as you travel. A lot of traditional, like Ampol, for example, have charging at their traditional petrol stations. Is there charging for is that limited to just passenger vehicles, or is there charging for you
could use the chargers, but it's just the accessibility. So they're going to be wider than the parking bays. By the time you put the cable in, it'll be hard. They're longer than cars, and so you're going to have traffic management issues. And also, you can have poor experiences with passenger vehicle drivers if you're using their chargers.
So just as traditional petrol stations have separate bays for larger delivery vehicles or trucks, do you think like some sort of
a solution like that would be a great inspiration to kind of, or we don't specifically talk about freight corridors, but like truck stops and things like that. That's where you'd consider putting for bigger vehicles, but like petrol stations that have space for truck and vans already, certainly. I mean, there's also a case to be said for existing programs putting in, the prerequisite that you put 5 passenger vehicles and 1 van one, and it's just a bit wider and a bit longer. And that becomes part of existing rounds of charging. So it's not these big rigs, right? But it's not small enough that it's a car. So you've kind of got this stopgap between recognising the need and then it being provisioned in the market now, because the vehicles are available, whereas big rigs, you've got a bit more time and they obviously need a lot more power and their solution is quite different. So we're splitting our focus on passenger and big rig, and then we're kind of forgetting some of these other vehicle types in existing infrastructure networks that really, if we considered now, we could start enabling uptake much quicker.
Okay, thank you.
And then, the third lever was incentive schemes. So tax breaks, direct incentives, something that reduces the sticker price for the owner operator and the driver and that kind of thing.
Okay. Any other questions from the committee members? All good? Alexandra and Lauren, thank you very much for appearing before the committee and for your evidence today. If you've been asked for any additional information, or if you have any additional information that applies from any of the questions today, feel free to pass it on to the Secretariat by the 9th of August. That would be appreciated. You'll also be provided a copy of the transcript of your evidence to the committee. And if you feel that there needs to be any corrections or additions made to that, then again, contact the Secretariat. With that, I thank you both for appearing before the committee and for your support in terms of the inquiry that we're conducting. Thank you.
Thank you.
We now will suspend until 10:45. underway. Yep. Okay, we now resume the hearing, the public hearing of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water for the inquiry into the transition to electric vehicle. I welcome witnesses from the New South Wales Young Lawyers Environment and Planning Subcommittee to the hearing. And for the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you. My name is Phoebe Saxon and I'm here in my capacity as the submissions co-coordinator of the New South Wales Young Lawyers Environment and Planning Law Subcommittee.
Phoebe, thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. With that opening comment, I invite you to make an opening address to the committee if you wish, and then we'll proceed to a discussion.
Great, thank you. I'll start with an opening statement. And first like to thank the Standing Committee for reviewing our submission and for inviting us to participate further in this inquiry. As I mentioned, I'm here on behalf of New South Wales Young Lawyers Environment and Planning Law Subcommittee we're a part of the Law Society of New South Wales. So our body represents young lawyers, so that's either within their first 5 years of practice or who are under the age of 36 and are comprised of both volunteers, subscribers, practicing lawyers, as well as students. So interested in the natural and built environment, and in particular on environmental and planning law issues. We recognise the current climate emergency and consider that Australia has the ability and responsibility to rapidly reduce emissions and actively help keep these world emissions within its remaining carbon budget. As such, we considered the transition away from fossil fuel dependent vehicles to electric vehicles being a crucial component of achieving our national ambitions of 43% below 2005 levels by 2030 and achieving net zero by 2050. As part of our submission, we reviewed some of the key direct and indirect consumer incentives which could be implemented in Australia, and that included researching the way in which the transition has been facilitated in other countries such as France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK and Norway, and some of the types of incentives that have been implemented in those countries. We also looked at how to best promote the installation of accessible charging infrastructure. So that was with attention to some of the efforts, in particular within the New South Wales planning law context, and that was with the amendments to the Transport and Infrastructure State Environmental Planning Policy in 2021. In addition to these direct and indirect consumer incentives, we also consider there is a key role for government to promote consumer awareness to facilitate the uptake and the transition to electric vehicles. And finally, we also provided a very high-level overview of the 2023 High Court case of Vanderstock and the state of Victoria, essentially confirming that Section 90 of the Constitution creates a constitutional imperative for the federal government to maintain exclusive control on the duty of excise, which we think is relevant in considering the types of incentives that can be implemented in the Australian framework. Happy to now proceed with questions.
Phoebe, thanks for those opening remarks, and also thank you for the written submission. One of the issues that we haven't really discussed at length in the course of this inquiry thus far is the issue of the planning system and what perhaps difficulties are currently being experienced with respect to the transition to electric vehicles that the planning system needs to also address. In other words, what changes, if any, are required to the current planning rules to help facilitate a transition. Is there any comments that you can make about that?
This was definitely something that we were considering, our committee, and problems that people are experiencing in installing infrastructure if they live in strata buildings, which I think for young people in general and young lawyers is a large issue in ensuring that they can have consent to actually install that infrastructure. A lot of people are trying to have charging cords going across pedestrian pathways. These obviously create a lot of safety issues, practical issues, And that was one of the reasons we were looking at the Transport and Infrastructure SEP amendments, because they do provide some steps towards making this an easier transition. I can talk a little bit about what those changes were, but the Standing Committee might be aware from our submission.
Well, perhaps if you do, at least even just touch on what the issues were.
Yeah, so what those amendments were looking at was how either public authorities, for example, local councils, would be able to construct electric vehicle charging stations. So for public authorities, they could install one of these units without consent, so long as it met specific criteria. So that included that it was on a footpath adjacent to a legal parking area, that it didn't obstruct vehicular, cyclist or pedestrian access or movement along a cycleway and footpath, and that it wasn't interfering with things like fire hydrants and those other considerations. It also allowed for any person to install an electric vehicle charging unit with consent from the relevant consent authority on relevant public land. So that was limited in the way that it was it had to be for the use of the owner of the adjacent residential premises. It also had to be for non-commercial use, connected to the electricity meter of the resident's own electricity, and that the cables were located underground. So that's one example of a state, and obviously at the local level as well, both the interactions where it's trying to create a pathway where that information is accessible, which we think is very important, that people understand what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do within these confines. We've obviously focused our submission on New South Wales because we do represent New South Wales young lawyers, but some role for consistency between states and local areas is something that we considered was very important, so that people are able to understand what they are allowed to do.
I'm going to put to you a scenario, and I'm just curious in your understanding of it. I don't expect a legal response that you'll be held to, but yesterday it was put to us that some of the electricity supply companies might consider installing a charging station at the base of an electric pole, a Stobie pole. Now, if that pole was on an arterial road or a highway, the road would be owned by the state government, who would be the managers of it. Mm-hmm. The planning regulations would be administered by the local council, but who would not have any control over the road itself and cannot make decisions about the road. Who would be the responsible authority, in your understanding, of whether a charging station would be permitted on a freeway or an arterial road?
I think it's definitely an interesting question. It's not something the committee specifically considered, but I'm happy to provide a little response more in my personal capacity as a practicing lawyer. I think that is a big unknown for a lot of the way in which this will be implemented, because there are different legislative provisions that they'll be subject to. There's the Roads Act, which does create this level of confusion. And it's certainly an issue that I think hasn't been resolved and does need to be resolved for the transition to go forward, and for there to be a clear pathway and avoid confusion, which may stop people from the uptake of electric vehicles.
Yep, thank you. Okay, other members, does anyone have any questions? Yeah. David.
Thanks very much. I was just digging into the issue you brought up, the New South Wales Act allowing private property owners to put charges linked to their account on public land, but the only people that can use it then, unless you're paying the electricity owner, how would it work? Like, for someone to have private exclusive use of the charger on public land, but what, do they pay a fee to the council? Or it seems a bit odd, because we're trying to increase the availability of charging, putting public charges on public land. Maybe put like in France, the car parking meter also has electricity and you can charge from that. So you pay for your parking, because some people with a non-electric car want to park there, and if they pay their parking fee, they can. But if you want to charge in diffuse places, that's the obvious solution to it. Don't you think that's sort of a bit counterproductive, that current law, or if I misunderstood it?
It's certainly an interesting point. I don't think it's necessarily counterproductive, the way that the committee understands how these laws operate, that there is still a focus on public authorities implementing and installing the units on public land, and they have ability to do that in a lot more publicly accessible places. I'm not the committee hadn't really considered how practically that might work in terms of if it is someone installing it adjacent to their residential premises on public land, how you would stop other people accessing that, or whether there would be some fee.
That's what I mean. If in your explanation, it has to be underground, and it has to be, the electricity has to be on the account of the owner adjacent
of that residential premises. That's certainly an interesting issue. We don't have experience in how that's working practically. These amendments were in 2021. It may be that councils have come up with some way to deal with this, but it's not something we're particularly aware of.
Right. Okay. Thanks. And what was the other High Court? What was the significance of the High Court case against Victoria?
Yeah,
Vanderstock and all. What was that?
We've only commented on that in a high level, noting we're not taxation lawyers, but the way that we understood that to be relevant was if the Commonwealth has the exclusive duty of excise, when looking at fiscal incentives that might be relevant to implement in Australia, that has to remain within the realm of the federal government as opposed to states. So that case came about by the state of Victoria, who were trying to implement specific, I believe, road use charges.
That's the road user charge case, is it?
And that's specific.
Okay, right.
Incentives.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. So,
Thanks.
Yeah, the state can't go it alone in imposing
A road user charge.
Yep.
Yeah.
If we're going to have road user charges for EVs, it's going to need to be imposed by the federal government nationally.
And what do you think about road user charges for EVs? Because you spoke about incentives internationally, and that's a follow-on from that as well. What incentives internationally do you think we should adopt here in Australia to try and make this better, to continue with what we're going? But with the road user charge, do you think we should have one?
That's not something that we'd considered as a subcommittee focused on environmental and planning law issues, and I don't think that we really have the expertise to comment on whether there should be one. We just want to ensure that if there are any direct fiscal incentives that are implemented, that obviously there's the correct levels and oversight, but otherwise that's not something we can comment on. In terms of other international incentives, so there were kind of some fiscal incentives that other countries had implemented. So there were a couple of examples in France, which, for example, they had a penalty tax on diesel vehicles, and then also looking at bonus taxes for electric vehicles, which I think is interesting, but obviously the balance needs to be maintained between not penalising people who can't necessarily afford electric vehicles and ensuring that this transition can occur. So these are all just examples we think are interesting to be aware of, but the practicalities of implementing them in Australia is obviously a very different area. Similarly, I think in Norway had some direct fiscal incentives, which again are interesting to look at. But I think it's those indirect incentives which are a bit more interesting. From
the research you guys have done, would EVs be a popular choice around the world if there wasn't incentives? Because it seems to be that every country is giving incentives for EV ownership. Would it still be the same kind of ownership if there wasn't incentives? Again, I don't think that's something we can necessarily confirm or comment on. I'm not sure what the research says about that. You can certainly see, for example, in Norway that we did look at, there is an incredibly large uptake of electric vehicles. Yes, there are incentives in place, but I think for
the uptake to get to, I believe from memory that it was, 70 or 80% of vehicles, and they're moving towards fully electric. It has to be a bit more layered than just incentives. I don't think that's the only reason that uptake is happening, but it certainly is one aspect of moving towards that transition.
Thank you.
I mean, the New South Wales SEP change is fascinating, especially earlier we had evidence in relation to strata, strata bodies, and the difficulty around different rules for getting strata approval, that some require 50% of owners, some 75%. Smaller stratas, 10 to 20, you might be able to get everyone in the room, easier to get approval. Large ones, 100 odd owners, much harder to get everyone across the line, especially if you're needing 75% approval. It's an interesting, I guess, concept that the New South Wales SEP change. Are you aware of where it's been implemented or put in practice? Because if it's for public land through local government in conjunction with large strata developments, I could see that that's an interesting way of getting over the hurdle of the 50 or, the large number of approval you need to get a strata over the line. Have you been able to find any examples where it's actually been applied?
Not when we were preparing our submission, but I do think that's a very interesting area. It's something we'd certainly be willing to take on notice and have a look at if there are any examples of how that would work. I mean, getting this implemented within strata buildings, I think, as young lawyers, is something we're particularly interested in. A lot of people are living in high density apartments, and this seems to be one of the big issues, people having to drive to shopping centres to charge vehicles rather than having them at home. So we'd certainly be willing to have a look if we can locate any examples of it being implemented successfully.
And maybe certain local government areas that are have at least a policy to look at it as they're approving applications. DAs and things like that. And then obviously, especially speaking in the New South Wales context, with the current, I guess, planning around housing, densification around public transport access, around the train lines and everything else, is there any planning for implementation of that SEP and more charging facility for the, because my understanding is if you've got train, that's great, but it's a first and last kilometre that's always the problem for public transport uptake, and so that's where I think opportunities might be.
Yeah.
And just going back to the strata, and you might not be able to answer this, but have you seen many legal cases where stratas have had to seek legal intervention to either progress EV charging stations within their complex or stop EV charging stations in their complex?
Also, it's not something that we've considered, but if we are looking again at maybe some of the relevant local councils and what has been done, that's certainly another interesting area. We'd be happy to have a look if there are any relevant cases, because it does seem to be something coming up consistently, and even in people within young lawyers and talking to people, that's one of the key issues.
When you do that, can you also look at, I guess the question also around, obviously owner occupiers is one thing, battling against maybe a larger strata, owners corporation, but also in relation to tenants. So, if there are any cases or has there been any litigation around, tenants wanting to should that form part of the kind of services available or, the right for enjoying the occupation of the premises, that access to facilities?
No, I think that's absolutely something interesting. We'd be happy to have a look at that as well.
And if you have any, I guess, thoughts or recommendation around, obviously, cracking that nut of tenants versus landlords and strata access to better energy efficiency, obviously charging through that, but also rooftop solar, those kind of aspects is a big issue that needs cracking at the moment.
No, absolutely.
Phoebe, on the question of the High Court case, I understand the decision. Are you aware of any research or any alternatives that were then looked at by the Victorian government to replace the fuel excise or the road user charge that they were proposing to bring in? given that they lost the High Court case?
It's not something that I'm aware of, the context and the repercussions that had for the state Victorian government. Can certainly have a look and take that question on notice if it's something that would assist the standing committee. But yeah, once again, that would be more from a policy perspective, as it has to do with the transition rather than any taxation position.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is the issue there is simply that electric vehicle users don't pay a road user charge, whereas the combustion engine vehicle users do through the fuel excise. And so, even though the High Court ruled that the legislation that the Victorians wanted to bring in would not be allowed, I would have thought that there might have been some
shortfall or
some alternative strategy for achieving the same outcome. And I don't know if you folks have had a look at that as well, as to what the alternatives for the Victorians would have been.
Yeah, not something that we had considered, but certainly interesting.
Yeah. You talk a lot about incentives for consumers to take up EVs. Is there anything that you would, if you would prioritise any incentives that come to mind, what would they be?
From our perspective, the key incentives we really considered to be the most important really did relate to this charging infrastructure and making that. I think there was one example we looked at where you could, in France, where you could get, I think some of the money that you put in to install back, or that might have been in the UK.
Right. So subsidies for the construction of the recharging stations.
Yes, which I did have. I think it was up to 75.
Paris, you've got obviously the parking. You know, there's incentives,
Yeah.
Free parking for EVs versus non-EVs overnight and things like that.
Yeah, and that's something that seemed to be fairly consistently offered in a few locations, whether it's free parking or whether it's for certain periods of time. Also to do with getting parking permits in areas where there's not a lot of parking available. Priority was given to owners of electric vehicles, which was quite interesting. But yeah, I think from our perspective, it's charging infrastructure and parking incentives obviously present one further incentive. But in terms of getting to the level where that's going to change people's minds about making decisions at the purchasing time, we'd consider maybe charging infrastructure would be more important.
With the current fuel combustion engines, the petrol stations, whether it's a voluntary code or not, tend to have standardised prices, which at least to some extent the consumer knows what the price is going to be. Did you folks do any research into how the price of recharging could be managed so that at least there was some uniformity in what consumers were paying?
This wasn't something that we looked at. It's certainly interesting. We're not aware of exactly how different places are operating pricing, so it will just be based on electricity prices and who is installing and maintaining this infrastructure. So no, it's not something that we're aware of.
Okay. All right. Is there any other questions from members?
Just, I guess, around the charging infrastructure incentives. So, I mean, there seems to be a focus on the idea that it's easier to incentivise home charging. But what about, for example, at work charge? Like, not that everyone gets obviously parking at work, but the difficulty of always incentivising at home precludes then, unless we can crack the tenant rights and things like that. So then, have you seen any examples where it's actually in the CBDs, in the corporate or in the car park stations, or, Northern Beaches, we have the Beeline where it's park and go. So having those kind of incentives so that it is actually it's on public land that the charging is, but it's not accessible to.
Yeah. And I think that presents an important aspect as well. It can't just be at-home charging infrastructure. There needs to be accessible charging infrastructure in a variety of places. I know the New South Wales SEP amendments did include for public authorities to install that kind of infrastructure more on public land, and that certainly seems to be something that's just as important for accessibility.
Okay, so that SEP might actually be being used by local governments for charging on public land.
I believe so.
More so than
the
private.
at-home element that we discussed. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Assume there's no other questions. With that, Phoebe, once again, thank you for appearing before the committee and for coming along today in person. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, or if you have any additional information that flows from the discussion today, feel free to pass it on to the Secretariat by the 9th of August if you can. And you will also be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to the committee. If you feel that there needs to be any adjustments or changes to that evidence, again, contact the Secretariat. Thank you once again.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
They are here. I think that Beck's just going to get them. Might have gone to the coffee shop or something.
Good morning. When you folks are ready, we'll kick off. So, okay. I now welcome witnesses from ACOM to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would each of you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? Who wants to go first?
I'll commence. Good morning. My name is Roger Jeffries. So I'm the Transport Decarbonisation and Future Mobility Leader for AECOM in the Australia-New Zealand region, and I'm based here in Sydney. In the capacity I'm here, I've worked with AECOM for 15 years, and I've got 25 years experience in the transport and mobility sector, largely working with government, public sector and private sector, advising them on transport, transit and mobility, and now this is crossing more and more over into the energy transition.
Thank you. Josh?
Josh Bridges. I'm a principal transport planner with AECOM. I've worked on a number of projects advising public and private clients, including several on electric vehicle charging. Prior to AECOM, I worked in new mobility service delivery for GoGet Car Share, where we sort of touched across a range of different service options and delivery, including electric vehicles, but also shared mobility and on-demand transport. So.
Thank you.
Craig Bearsley, I'm Director of Energy for AECOM in Australia and New Zealand, so I lead our energy business and offering across that region. Civil engineer by background, I've been with AECOM for 12 years and 20-year career in the energy sector, in the design, planning and delivery of energy infrastructure, including renewable energy projects, wind, solar, and hydropower as well as energy storage, BESS projects and pumped hydro, and transmission and distribution infrastructure.
Thank you. Now, does one of you or each of you want to make an opening statement? And if so, I'll leave it to you to decide who does that, and then we'll move into questions and discussion.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll make an opening statement on our behalf. But we thank you for the invitation to attend today and welcome the opportunity to participate in this inquiry. In Australia, AECOM has delivered projects to support the electric vehicle transition in New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia, Victoria and the Australian Capital Territory. Globally, we've worked extensively with government and asset owners on the transition to zero-emission vehicles in the USA and Canada, UK and Ireland, Europe, the Middle East and Asia. Our teams have delivered over 600 electric vehicle transition projects, from roadmaps and strategies to individual charging sites, including for Parliament House in Australia. Our work covers transport operations and infrastructure, resources and waste, market dynamics and electric grids. Our experience in the EV transition for the transit sector is especially strong. In the US alone, we've worked with 48 transit agencies to help transition over 130 depots and fleets to battery electric buses. From that experience, we know that Australia is at a tipping point as we move beyond early adoption to wider societal transition. However, to unlock this opportunity, we suggest two things must remain central to our national approach. Our conversations on electric vehicle transition should adopt a holistic view and move beyond just the private car, to all modes in the transport sector, to fleets, buses, freight and bicycles. Secondly, there's a sizable need to empower and enable infrastructure owners to support this transition, providing them with assurance, support and the pathways to confidently embrace electrification. I'd also like to just summarise our recommendations from our submission to the inquiry. We made 24 recommendations and summarised those into 7 categories. Number 1, progress the electric vehicle infrastructure strategy and delivery to drive overall EV growth, address challenges and barriers that may slow or impede a market-led transition. Number 2, support state governments in the transition to zero-emission buses and grow the domestic capability to meet demand, particularly considering the Brisbane 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Number 3, adopt market support measures to improve the underlying market barriers to EV adoption with a focus on job growth in planning, operations and manufacturing. Number 4, maintain and improve the regulatory conditions on the environmental impacts to reduce the impact of battery life cycles, with market support to advance the circular economy in batteries. Number 5, support the transition of the electrical grid towards a smart grid to leverage the opportunities afforded by electric vehicles, providing critical upgrades to weak areas of the grid. Number 6, adopt safer regulations based on international lessons and best practice to manage the risk around EV battery fires and improve consumer confidence in electric vehicles. And number 7, improve pathways for attracting and upskilling staff on the complexity of the EV provision across the transport and energy sectors. So we thank you for your time and we look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Roger, thank you for that. Josh and Craig, did you wish to add to any of those comments? All right, well, I'll just kick off. Given from your submission the extensive experience you've had in the EV transition, if you were asked what are the perhaps top 3 barriers to people or companies converting to electric vehicles, how would you rate them? What would it be? You know, just for example, and I don't know that this is the answer. Is it the cost? Is it the lack of charging stations that are out there? Is it the resale value of the vehicles? How would you rate the critical barriers to why more people are not transitioning to electric vehicles?
Would you like to go first? Sure. That's a very nuanced question. It depends quite significantly on the user that you're considering. So in terms of sort of what we typically consider an EV transition or an EV customer, that's typically the private vehicle. For those individuals, price is certainly a significant barrier. The majority of vehicles on the Australian market remain at fairly high price points. That is slowly shifting as more and more models come onto the market. There's also the question around infrastructure, which is, we know, a significant problem. We know that most individuals will be able to charge and meet most of their energy needs at home. However, there's still a large proportion of the population who don't have at-home charging capabilities, or whose needs themselves may require sort of on-the-go charging as we go. And our overall network is not to the point where I would say most people would feel the assurance that necessarily if they're out on the road and the battery is starting to run dry, that they're going to be able to easily find a charging station. Now that is changing, but it's still a very significant barrier that we need to overcome in terms of infrastructure provision. When you expand that to other user groups, it's really on a sort of a more case-by-case basis. Fleets have a very different need, predominantly around the infrastructure at depots. Public transport fleets have themselves their own operational considerations, and then heavy vehicles as well, again, a different barrier as well. So it's really understanding who the customer breakdown that we're trying to target and understand. And that's why I think, as Roger summarized, that our core belief is that we need to have a very holistic view towards electric vehicles. If we're saying that we need there to be an EV transition, it can't just be private cars. It should be across the entire sector.
And my understanding is that the Scandinavian countries have probably got the highest rate of electric vehicle use. What did they do? Again, this is a very general question. What did they do to get the transition to the levels that they were able to achieve? What did they do that's different to, say, what we're doing in Australia or perhaps in other countries in Europe or the USA?
Maybe to follow on from the response that Josh gave before, but a bit more flavour. So I think there's a range of factors. There's obviously there's the cost of buying a vehicle. You know, most people tend to own a vehicle for 10 years or so, and to invest in a new vehicle just purely around personal choice around I'd like to choose an electric vehicle is not a choice that most people make when they're just buying a vehicle. As well as that, the cost of electric vehicles has been higher here in Australia than it has in other parts of the world. Historically, the availability of vehicles here has been a barrier. That's changing now with some of the changes that the federal government's made around the new vehicle emission standards, the National Electric Vehicle Policy. That's starting to change that dynamic. So I think that those barriers are starting to be removed already here in Australia, or the dynamics changing on those. I think the other point that Josh made around infrastructure is a key one. As anyone who's driven an internal combustion engine vehicle knows, you can readily get in your vehicle and drive anywhere, and there's a plethora of publicly available charging stations anywhere you go, and you don't have to worry about it. So I think that perception of the barrier to the risk that I can get in an electric vehicle, then drive somewhere, and then I won't be able to charge, I think has historically been a barrier. And I think other countries around the world have maybe tried to invest in some of that infrastructure earlier and sort of seed fund that, so that those removing some of those barriers, perceived or otherwise, maybe a little bit earlier in the life cycle. I don't think it's an entirely negative picture for Australia where we are now, and we're certainly catching up. But I think there's things that we could potentially do in areas where around infrastructure. Some of them Josh mentioned, strata developments, for example, in Australia. There's a lot of challenges there around putting in EV charging there. There are moves being made around that, but not everyone has the ability to afford their own home with a garage in Australia because of the nature of our housing market. So people who don't have a facility to charge their vehicle at home, then there becomes a barrier, which is, well, is there charging available on the street in the vicinity of their home or where they work, or where they travel to every day, or can we address the issues around strata for people who live in smaller like units or townhouses?
Has the fact that Australia has right-hand drive vehicles added to the price differential between what we pay here and what other countries are paying?
It probably certainly doesn't help. As you mentioned, the Scandinavian countries have a head start on just about everybody in the world. That probably does have some impact on the fact that they're part of sort of a wider European market, but also, as I mentioned, sort of a different side of the road that they're driving on, so they can access vehicles that would also be sold in North America and large parts of Asia. I don't think we'd be recommending that we need to change the side of the road that we're driving on, but it probably does mean that there's potential that we could have discussions with other national governments who are driving on the same side as us. People in the UK, obviously, Japan, I believe India drives on the same side as us as well. So there's a potential that there could be coordination on that side. I don't think it's within our sort of realm of expertise around how the manufacturers themselves are playing off different markets, but it certainly wouldn't go awry to probably have a bit more coordination in that regard.
Okay. All right, I'll hand over to my colleagues. Who wants to go first?
Happy to. You spoke in your recommendations around the life cycles of batteries. What are your views on the battery passports that the EU is doing? Do you have any knowledge around that? What do you think of them?
It's not within my, I haven't done any work specifically around the life cycles of batteries. I know we have other sort of people within our organization who have a much more expertise. Yeah. Fortunately, they're not located in Sydney today. There is an ongoing question around batteries, and obviously it is something that can act as a barrier to people wanting to uptake EVs because they're worried about what happens if that battery needs to be replaced and there's a cost to it. There's potential market solutions that you could have there. The development of a second-hand electric vehicle markets through potential fleet off sales, government fleet or private vehicle fleet. They're typically held for much shorter periods of time than the private vehicle fleet is, so sort of 3 to 4 years at most. At that stage, the battery's in much stronger condition still, and so you could potentially move it through that. We do know that there's a lot of potential as well for the batteries to be recycled into other uses at the end of their life cycle as well. There's still potential to use them for sort of battery storage. Craig probably has a bit broader understanding around battery storage than I do. That's my understanding.
No worries, thank you.
Can I just follow on there with the fleet sales of the EVs? We heard a long time ago that some EV sales that were fleet vehicles in ACT, they were getting passed in at auction because they weren't hitting the reserves, because people weren't buying them because they didn't know how the batteries were, even though they're only 3 or 4 years old, even less than that I think they were, but they had no guarantee of the battery. Is there some things happening in Australia like a battery roadworthy that you guys know of, to be able to tell how damaged that battery is or how in good condition that battery is?
I mean, the testing is available. It's there. I'm not sure which manufacturers are offering that. You might see with traditional vehicles, you'll get a certified, approved used vehicle. I don't know specifically about the electric vehicles in that market where they're offering that and the certification of those batteries and providing certification of their condition in terms of the remaining life expectation on those batteries. But that you would think, I'm not an expert, would be a fairly low-hanging fruit for making those vehicles more appealing in a second-hand market.
Because most fleet vehicles go straight to auction. They don't go to dealers, they don't go anywhere else, they go straight to the auction house and then get pushed out from there. So to really get good consumer confidence that what they're buying is actually going to be okay for them for the next 5 years, there definitely needs to be a lot of work done there to get that consumer confidence.
Absolutely. And I'd say most auction houses probably don't have the equipment or the facilities designed for that, so it's definitely a black gap in the market.
In your work, am I understanding correctly? You're delivering, I guess, for clients sort of how to plan an electrification of their fleet. Are you also doing it for, I guess, we were just hearing from IKEA around that issue of that mid-size commercial vehicles. Is that part of what you do around like minivans and sort of smaller trucks? Is that an area that you look at in terms of helping, I guess, companies electrify their fleets? Or is it just passenger vehicles?
No, look, so I work around the world, and here in Australia, it encompasses all aspects of the transport sector, from like heavy vehicles, small rigid vehicles for more urban freight movements, private vehicles, certainly transit sector, but that includes buses and even maritime ferries as well. So certainly, I guess we've got some thoughts probably around the freight sector. That's probably quite a challenging sector to electrify right now, but there are some areas that maybe are forging ahead within that. We're not working directly with IKEA, so I can't speak to their challenges and problems, and I know others who are. But certainly there's a lot of considerations around the freight sector, I think, which probably need to be broken down into the subsets of the freight sector between sort of intercity, sort of line haul freight, which typically operates on very low margins and needs very high operating hours, which right now there's certainly lots of challenges around the nuances between the payload that they need to carry and the size of battery that would probably require for those vehicles, and then the regulation in Australia for the steering axle load limits, which when you get to heavy batteries, that probably won't be feasible to operate here in Australia right now. On the flip side of that, we're seeing new technologies come in and changes where battery technology itself is getting better, and batteries are getting lighter and denser, so you can take more payload in terms of the battery for a lighter battery, but that still probably won't provide for that sort of line haul freight in the short term. So I think there's things there where we might need to think about that as maybe a harder to access part of the sector in the short term, but what can we do to work towards a longer term solution, like for example considerations around hydrogen or green hydrogen. How do we make that cheaper? How do we make it more accessible? There are short-term options like low-carbon fuel, which obviously the Australian federal government's supporting, and I think that's probably the right move in the next 10 to 15 years to make that sector better, but not perfect. And then while we look at for either technology to catch up or for hydrogen to become the best solution potentially in the long term, who knows? Just speculating about what might happen in 10 to 15 years' time. But then other aspects of the sector, like for example, more urban freight movements, I think the vehicle fleets generally are there. The battery electric vehicles for urban freight movements for rigid vehicles, the fleets are available in the market. They are being used by some companies. And then you get to the lower end of the market, as I said, the smaller end of the market, more sort of first mile, last mile, and there's certainly the ability to use things like electric cargo bikes. You can disaggregate freight at the local level. I mean, over the road here in Sydney, the City of Sydney is using Goulburn Street car park to break down freight and then encouraging people to use electric cargo bikes for last mile deliveries within the city. You see Australia Post is running a fleet of electric little tuk-tuks or whatever we want to call them running around the streets, which work really well. So there's if you break down the sector into its constituent parts, I think there's some things that are low-hanging fruit that are there now that we can be using and are using in some organisations. Maybe there might be a need to help encourage that across the broader spectrum of the freight sector, but the larger vehicles, or even maybe the mid-size vehicles, depending on what we define as mid-size, maybe there's some opportunity there for the federal government to help with sort of incentivisation or subsidies or something to help some parts of that sector move forwards, because there is a very heavy upfront cost in the larger vehicles you go for, the more the upfront capital cost of those vehicles, and those parts of the freight sector work on very, very low margin, less than 2%. So, for them to be able to, for the private sector to be able to justify that spend is very, very challenging sometimes, depending on the scale of the organisation, obviously.
I mean, they raised also the access to charging infrastructure. So for that mid-size, like a delivery van, doesn't fit in a traditional passenger vehicle size charging bay. And so we tend to be talking heavy vehicle, large freight or passenger vehicles. We actually haven't talked as much, I would say, of that middle level access to charging infrastructure. Is that something you've looked at?
No, absolutely. I think you're right that there's a I think in the work done to date, or the development of charging infrastructure, a lot of it's been focused on providing access in terms of like, publicly accessible charging.
So passenger vehicles.
Passenger vehicles, and that, you know, those facilities have been designed around that. I mean, I think now certainly when we work with clients, and you know, the broader challenges of what we're looking at. So how can we make those facilities better accessible to different types of vehicles? So like you said, like medium vehicles or different types of even personal vehicles, maybe where the charging ports might be in different locations and different manufacturers have different standards. So, you know, making them more like drive-through bays, for example, or, you know, there's various options for how you can provide charging infrastructure. You can have drop-down cables, which you don't need to be a crossfitter to use because they're supported by, you know, systems like pulleys. So you don't need to be very strong to be able to pull them down, but, you know, rather than just a sort of floor-mounted cable charging system.
Yep. We've recently wrapped up a project working in the ACT on something very similar to that, not around freight specifically, but around sort of mid-size heavy vehicles. And it was similar to that. The use case comes into a very important consideration of you can't, say, pack in the vehicles into a depot overnight that you might normally, because they're all charging, and if one needs to get out or if there's a fire, they have to sort of be spaced and managed appropriately. So it changes sort of the underlying dynamics of how you manage your own fleet a bit more, which is something that I think sort of fleet owners and asset owners and infrastructure owners may not have full clarity on, and that's sort of a bit of a gap in their own knowledge base. And that's where we try to help and provide a bit more advisory support through.
Because she raised like an example of in Germany where industrial sort of centres might have a kind of a common property area for charging infrastructure for mid-size delivery vans or sort of industrial use vehicles. Is that something that you've got any thoughts or recommendations on, or awareness?
Look, and I think it sounds very sensible to me. I mean, I think we need to think about charging in a whole range of different destinations and origins as well. And you know, for the freight movement industry or for servicing and deliveries, I think that needs to be in different locations, not just where they charge overnight, but also you need opportunity charging as well. So certainly like in industrial parks or business parks, where there's a lot of movements of those sorts of vehicles, and absolutely providing infrastructure there. I guess the point might come as to who pays for that and who the owner of the broader site is. Is it the developer of the site? Is it a public charging, a public sector provided facility? I guess you start to move into the realms of what how do you pay for the asset, but also how do you pay for the electricity as well. So it's more sort of charging as a service, but there's many different ways of making it work. Further to what Josh said, we're actually working with one of the major airports here in Australia now, looking at a multi-user facility landside for them, which can be used by people driving to pick up and drop off at the airport, by rideshare, by taxis, and by other people servicing the airport as well. So that probably goes a bit to what you're talking about there in terms of the example.
You brought up hydrogen just before. How do you see hydrogen fitting into the market here?
Hydrogen's an interesting one. We've been doing a range of different studies in hydrogen for long-haul freight in particular, where we see there is a potential use case. I think overall we do expect hydrogen to play a major part in our energy sector in the future. It is going to be slower than we were maybe anticipating 2-3 years ago. I think the initial hydrogen hype that it was going to solve all our decarbonisation challenges were possibly a little bit optimistic. A big part of that has been we're now going through these early feasibility studies around green hydrogen and have a better idea of the true cost to produce that. And a big part of that is the electricity cost. So electricity costs will need to come down significantly. And that relies on the rollout of a lot more renewable energy than we currently have in Australia. So we might be some years away from seeing cost parity between hydrogen for long-haul freight and traditional diesel. That may be some years away, but there is a use case there where technologies today, or what technologies we can foresee in the near future for EVs, won't be there to allow long haulage either. So, I mean, you had an interesting comment I think before, Roger, that potentially there's going to be a range of solutions that we have over the next 10 to 15 years for long haulage, until such time as electric vehicles and battery technologies has progressed to allow that to be a possibility, and hydrogen may well be part of that solution, but it's still some time away in terms of cost parity. Big part of that is going to be efficiency, cost of electrolyzers, and cost of electricity, and that's not forecast to change in the next 2 to 5 years.
Thank you.
I think at a strategic level, I think we all agree that we need to be considering hydrogen now as part of the mix in the future, but I think part of the joke maybe in the industry is that hydrogen's always been the technology that's 5 years away, and every year it's another 5 years away. So I think that's where we're trying to be realistic about when we say we think hydrogen should be part of the mix, but we need to think about other things in the short to medium term.
David, did you have any questions?
Thanks. Just want to go back to one of the other questions they gave you about the battery testing of used EVs. For us to find out, is there car diagnostics? Surely Tesla or BID or Polestar can just plug it in and read what the capability of the battery or the number of cells that are healthy remaining, or am I misguided? And is there a way we can get that sort of standardised so that it is a use to the used car EV market?
I'm no expert in EVs. I suppose here as the energy sector person, so I'm mostly familiar with much bigger batteries that do have those diagnostics and battery management systems built into them. So you're constantly monitoring the condition of all your cells, and you know exactly where you are in the condition, and you actually optimize the operation of that battery to maximize its life and minimize degradation. You're constantly making optimization decisions in real time around how you use that battery in the electricity market. There's no reason why that same technology would not exist within a Tesla or other vehicle. I'm sure that information is available within the vehicle.
Sure.
But is it standardized? Is it accessible? Is it available in a way that's understandable to consumers and giving them confidence? I couldn't answer that, but I think it's something that we should be looking into.
Right. Okay.
I mean, at the general level, obviously, one benefit of electric vehicles is, as you rightly say, that once you plug it in, you've plugged it into the diagnostic system. It's like putting an ECG on a car.
Yeah.
So every vehicle basically has, every charger has that ability to do that. Maybe part of what you're talking about is can we access that information, and can the consumer access that information? Can they understand it, or can someone who's buying or selling a vehicle understand it? I think that's maybe where maybe some degree of regulation or standardisation or to the market to specify the information that you can get out of the unit as readily available, usable information. I mean, obviously, I personally don't own a Tesla, but I know people who do own Teslas, and I know the app and I know the software they use, and there's very readily available diagnostics. But that's just one manufacturer, and that's not available for everyone, and not everyone will buy that vehicle. So. We do face similar challenges in other parts of the transport sector, not just the private vehicle market, but also in the transit sector, where there are maybe some barriers where the vehicle manufacturer OEMs and the charging unit providers are reticent to provide all the what should be readily available information to the users, i.e. to public transport operators or government. And we certainly recommend that when specifying contracts, that users specify that information is to be made available through the provision of the infrastructure. Because, for example, in the transit sector, you want to make sure that you are diagnosing any potential issues with buses, and then or wider other bigger freight fleets, and then diagnosing them prior to any incidents happening, so you can prevent potential for fires or any other incidents.
Yeah. Just also wanted to take up your observation that most of us agree with, for the charging infrastructure to be public, because it needs to be where the cars are when they're not being used, like during the day. So the car park just diagonally across the road, if that was a EV charging car park, you might get more people driving EVs into the city. But if you could clarify for us, I'm told that if you had that, you would really need to put new substations and lots of other hardware into a situation like that. You couldn't just plug into the existing electricity that's running past a public car park or a public business. Once you get that amount of cars charging, you do what I just said, a whole new substation?
Yeah, you would in some cases, depends on the scale we're talking about. I think, as was mentioned earlier by Joss and Roger, is the vast majority of people who would drive a car to the city would have access to charging at home if you are an EV owner currently. And that would be the more convenient way to charge your vehicle, would be at home overnight than it would be to do it in a
It'd be more
car.
convenient, but you've got all this excess solar most days in the middle of the day when people are at work, and you can't charge on your solar at night because it's night.
True. That's a true case. Whether we're encouraging a lot of people to drive their cars to the city, for example, I would think probably that's not the end goal. But the general concept of can you put large amounts of public charging infrastructure in our existing grid, in our distribution networks, yes, but there's limits, of course, to that particular connection. And you can stretch that connection further in terms of with other technologies that are built into the charging infrastructure itself. So energy storage, so battery units that are tied to the charging infrastructure can help manage peaks. Also time of use charging and scheduling. So when you know more about those vehicles and how long they're going to be there, when they're going to be leaving, etc., within the car parks, you can schedule the charging between the different vehicles and effectively give you a much larger capacity. Because it wouldn't take the full 8 hours somebody's at work, for example, to charge a small passenger vehicle when it's likely not empty in the first place when it arrived in. So there's a lot of technologies that can help us to provide a lot more capacity to provide that service to many more vehicles without overloading the grid, but there are naturally limitations to the grid. And then you're making decisions between augmenting the grid itself and providing additional substation capacity, additional lines capacity, or providing additional energy storage within the system to help smooth out and charge overnight, for example. Potentially the charging infrastructure itself could charge up overnight to be ready in the morning once you know more about the timing of the use.
And with the really fast ones, which I gather are DC chargers, do you need to have like a 3-phase power connection for those ones? Because part of the problem with the charging is you got to stop for 40 minutes, a couple of hours. I know my brother-in-law on a trip out west, they had to sort of bunny hop all the way out to a farm, and one of their biggest delays was not being hooked up, was waiting to get to be hooked up. So why aren't we accentuating the rollout of the fast chargers and charge the people who plug into them rather than the little ones in everyone's house?
There are movements in that direction. Certainly there's been the typical investment from government has been more towards those sort of fast chargers. I know the New South Wales government and the NRMA have had partnerships around providing fast chargers. I think the challenge is just the number of routes that you can travel and the level of support for the infrastructure that we've so far had. We haven't reached a point where necessarily even all of the main primary routes that we're traveling around have maybe met the level of demand that there currently is, let alone sort of the projected future demand. So certainly we need to be prioritizing those fast charging for out of city routes. But your sort of day-to-day driving within the city, most trips are actually well within the range, at least within sort of metropolitan capital cities of Australia, within the range that you'd be able to undertake within a single charge on a day. It's really, if we're going to focus on that really fast charging in the regions, that's where we should definitely be looking.
Yeah, but
distances
need
further.
If you had a fast charger, say up at Raymond Terrace before you got on the freeway, you'd have to have full on like 3 or 4 lines going into the petrol or the charging station.
The 3-phase versus 1-phase, that's more of a consumer home issue. When we're talking about this kind of infrastructure, we're making a connection directly to the distribution network at higher voltages. You're not at the lower voltage that comes to your house. So, but the fast chargers maybe obviously have a much higher draw. So, one fast charger might be the equivalent of 3 slow chargers in terms of the amount of draw. from the network, and there will always be a limit on the network in terms of how much you can connect, whether that be 1 megawatt, 10 megawatts, and that'll vary by location and where you are on the distribution network or the transmission network for that matter. So if we want to find locations for large numbers of fast chargers, we'll need to look specifically at the grid and select locations where that capacity exists. And there are many locations where that capacity exists. Typically, if you're adjacent to a substation, you'll have no issue with the kinds of connections, whether it might be 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts. We deal with these same issues when we're looking at connecting other large loads, such as a data center or a new industrial facility. They're all just large load connections, and the same considerations need to be made about where they are located so that it's efficient to achieve that 100 megawatt connection, for example. If you want to choose your location first and consider the grid afterwards, that's when you need to have a look at other solutions. So do we need to augment and upgrade the grid, or do we need to look at on-site energy storage to allow us to provide that fast charging peak and effectively trickle charge our charging station when there is low demand? That's the other option that we can look at. But my approach would be to look at the grid. We have in Australia, if we're talking rural areas, regional areas where we'll need to place these chargers, we are quite limited in our grid, very different from Europe or other locations where the grid is everywhere. The vast majority of Australia is off-grid. People don't realise that our transmission networks in Australia do not cover more than about 30% of the country. So up and down the East Coast, we're quite fortunate. But as you move inland, the grid becomes patchier, thinner, and finding connection locations for very large loads becomes more difficult.
Okay, thanks.
I want to ask about the vehicle to grid. Obviously, there's great opportunity there for solving some of our storage challenges and reducing some of that, I guess, transmission infrastructure costs and rollout that would be needed. And so, for example, just taking that example, like the car park across the road's got a bay of about, I think it's about 10 electric chargers for during the day. And that, are you looking in other jurisdictions or here, obviously, the opportunity of vehicle to grid, of charging during the day at work when the vehicle's sitting there, and then that charge being fed back into the grid at night to help with the peaks. Is that something you are looking at as an organisation?
Absolutely. I mean, at a high level, vehicle to grid or other home battery units or batteries that might be owned by the distribution utilities and embedded within their networks all have the ability to greatly reduce the burden that our cities place on our transmission networks by smoothing the way the loads and being far more efficient. Effectively, all our transmission that we have around the country is designed for the peaks, the peak demand and there's a huge amount of spare capacity in our transmission all the rest of the time, right? So if we can find ways to more efficiently use electricity across a longer duration in terms of the day, smooth it day to day, so intraday smoothing, and all these forms of storage, including vehicle batteries, has the potential to do that. So I think there's a really exciting opportunity for electric vehicles to not add to the challenges we have in the energy transition, to actually be a really key supporter of the energy transition and a key lever we have to pull to actually help enable significantly more renewables to be deployed in Australia. I'm not totally abreast of where the technologies are at in terms of allowing that vehicle to grid and all the other issues that might potentially come into that around battery life, etc., and cycling. But I think those are challenges that the technology companies are and should be looking to overcome. And as a government, we'll need to look at how we address the regulations that might make that difficult. The energy retailers, the distributors also have a role to play in creating the incentives and mechanisms in place to allow people to do that and encourage people to do that. But for me, it's very exciting. I think electric vehicles will be a big enabler of the energy transition. People sometimes get stuck on the idea that there's a whole lot of additional electricity we have to find from somewhere to power all these electric vehicles. I think it'll be the other way around in the long term, that they'll support a lot more renewables in our grid.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing. There's a concern by some around more electric vehicles is going to require more production of electricity because of charging, and electrification. But with electrification comes all these additional machines with batteries that can actually supplement that demand of the grid in a more specific geographic location, rather than it being remote and having to be brought to it's in situ.
Mm-hmm. The other point about electric vehicles and energy storage in general is it has the ability to utilize underutilized generation from renewables. So whether it be wind at night or solar in the middle of the day, as the point was made earlier, by giving value to that currently undervalued or excess energy, it improves the overall business case for renewable projects. Lifts that minimum price, or avoids negative pricing, which does happen as well, and allows, hopefully, for overall lower power prices for people, more renewable projects deployed.
So Jeff, you've mentioned micro-mobility, so obviously there's focus on EVs, but and we're seeing buses go electric, which is great, but then that question around e-bikes, e-cargo bikes, e-scooters, they all help in that congestion piece. Did you have anything more you wanted to say about that?
Look, I mean, certainly I think in terms of how we can move Australia to a lower emissions future, from a professional point of view, I would say that we need to be encouraging people to be able to choose to use public transport or active transport or whichever mode they can do, rather than just having the private car as the only option, which it is for a lot of people still. And obviously that's why we're investing in public transport. The micromobility modes definitely provide an attractive alternative in a lot of use cases, and the availability of batteries versus just human power is something which opens up for example, for e-bikes. I have colleagues who live in the northern beaches and then commute to the city, and some of them wouldn't either have felt that they were physically capable of doing that in the past, but now they purchase an e-bike and they say that that's now a viable choice and they use that every day versus even say getting out of public transport. So I think personally, I think we should be encouraging the availability of a whole range of different options for people in the market. One thing I would say as a word of caution is that up to now, and we haven't talked about fire life safety much in this session, a lot of the issues that have happened have been around low quality micro-mobility devices. I think most people are aware of that, like e-scooters that have come out of some parts of the world, poor quality batteries, and they're the ones that have caught the headlines for causing fires in people's homes, for example. So I think that is an issue maybe for regulation around that part of the market, just to make sure that nothing untoward happens, or we minimise the untoward incidents that happen in future from those sorts of poorly manufactured, low cost mobility devices.
So the cheaper e-scooters, e-bikes are more concerning.
Yes.
I mean, I've also had brought to me, the monowheels, which they are very annoyed that they are still not allowed to use them on our roads, but they are something that can solve that first and last kilometre problem to public transport.
Sure.
Take it. And then basically they hold it like a suitcase on the bus. Obviously.
Maybe one further point that I could raise is that in terms of policy, is that we don't have a standard across Australia for say electric scooters and where you can ride them. We have cities like Sydney which have compared to say Canberra or Brisbane, very narrow footpaths because of the nature of the way the cities have evolved over time. So there are challenges in how and where you allow or enable people to ride certain devices where they fit in the mobility mix. And being a pedestrian, being a cyclist, being a car user at times, I can see the pros and cons for each. But I think it's we've typically struggled to even deliver appropriate facilities for cyclists. Say, and my personal view is that you should look at the speed and the risk around different devices and where they fit in the mobility mix. And I would say that e-scooters would be more akin to bicycles, certainly in an urban environment. So, focusing around bicycle lanes rather than heavily contested urban footpaths where we have very limited space, and you can be in a wheelchair or pushing a pram. Someone's coming along at 15 kilometres an hour versus 6 kilometres an hour. That certainly increases the risk, and we know that everyone walks around with a device in their hand and doesn't really look at where they're walking these days. So I don't think it's just it's about having clarity, because we all live in Australia, and we don't just live and work and play in one city. And you can travel to Canberra and you can get on an electric scooter and get on the footpath and ride it around. You do the same in Brisbane. You can't do that in Sydney or Melbourne. So maybe having some better collaboration with the states, or encouraging better sort of thinking around that would be standardisation would be helpful for everyone, even those of us who live within Australia, let alone people who travel to Australia and then have to work out what the rules are in every different city.
And building on that as well, it's widely known within transport that the potential for active transport to help solve some of our congestion issues, as well as the health issues and a range of sort of societal problems, is well known, and there's consistent movement towards increasing the adoption of active transport, and certainly e-bikes, e-scooters, seen as a potential game changer in opening up a wider audience and sort of customer base to using those modes. And as Roger mentioned, there's been a lot of coverage of the fires that have been coming from particular variants of those, and there's definitely a concern that as that's magnified within the media, that there could be a sort of an impact on people's willingness to adopt that because of fear. And so if the government can step in and help sort of address those through regulation, make them perceived as a more high quality product, that we can still sort of leverage those benefits that e-bikes and e-scooters have in terms of solving the broader transport problem that we have within our cities.
And it's not just their batteries either, it's also batteries of cheap quality tools. The lithium-ion batteries and cheap quality tools. It's many, many things where they're getting through our borders and coming into the country. So it's not just the scooters and the bikes and the hoverboards and things like that. It needs to be looked at. The whole battery system needs to be looked at.
Maybe one further point just on fire life safety I might make, if I may. There's one statistic that might be worth just noting for record. So in terms of on-road transport, so all vehicles on the road, for every 100,000 kilometres of vehicle driven on the road, electric vehicles are 60 times less likely to catch fire than an internal engine vehicle. That's based on fact.
60 times
60
less
times likely to catch fire than an internal combustion.
Is that from a report or a study?
I can find the reference.
If that can be provided,
that would be great.
Yes, because there's a lot of perceptions around fire risk, but EVs, vehicles themselves, less so. It's then the cheaper other modes of transport.
And in terms of vehicles, we typically see that electric vehicles, of whichever, whether it's private vehicles or buses or heavy haulage vehicles, they don't catch fire when they're being charged. That's not a point of risk. They tend to only have incidents after the battery's been damaged in an accident, which is why, going back to the point that was made before, that having that battery monitoring and through the charging kit is your ability to sort of test that even after an incident to see whether there is an issue, and if so, whether you have to replace cells in a battery. And we have the ability to identify that. Obviously, as long as all of the units have that information and it's been made available.
I think the other point on the e-mobility is the servicing and maintenance. We typically, if you buy an EV, it's an expensive vehicle. You have it serviced, you have it maintained. The types of e-mobility we're talking about. I live in Manly, and many teenagers I see leaving large black e-bikes leaning against trees in the rain, and I'm pretty sure they're not servicing, maintaining, or doing any checks on those, and that is a concern as well. So I think it might not be around the battery quality itself, but the general quality of the surrounding housing, the waterproofing, all the other elements that make up those pieces of equipment, where they're trying to hit the lowest cost possible. They're trying to market them to parents with teenagers they don't want to take to every various event and sports occasions. So there is a bit of regulation needed there, and it has been I suppose, a point of contention, particularly in the Manly area.
But it hasn't been able.
We're going to have to bring this to a close.
It has reduced congestion.
Yes.
we've pretty much run out of time, but I want to finish with this question, given the issue of fires and that have been raised. From your understanding and experience overseas, have insurance costs for electric vehicles gone up in comparison to combustion engine vehicles? Are they higher? In Australia, we've tried to get some clarity here in Australia. Everybody says it's still too early in the process. What about other countries?
So, to my knowledge, the insurance cost of electric vehicles is not higher overseas. The only caveat I would put on that is that certainly here in Australia, the price of electric vehicles, the price point is higher. So obviously the insurance cost is related to the price of the vehicle. So proportionally it might be higher, but that's because the vehicle cost is slightly higher. We've actually done work overseas, working in collaboration with the insurance sector and fleet and asset owners of electric vehicles and done fire life safety studies with them to look at the sort of insurable risk as well. So, but that doesn't necessarily answer your question directly about the overall cost.
My question I'm trying to get to the bottom of for a consumer is my insurance cost going to be higher or not? Simple as that.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think it's a direct increased cost because it's an electric vehicle. No. But I think going back to the point that I made before, that the actual risk around say fire incidents in a battery electric vehicle is actually far lower than an internal combustion in your vehicle, and obviously insurance costs are generally risk based.
Yeah. All right. Well, I thank all three of you for your attendance here today, and if you've been asked to provide any additional information, if you could do that by the 9th of August, it would be appreciated. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to the committee today. If you feel you need to make any corrections or additions to the answers you've given, please feel free to do so.
Certainly. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee.
Once again, thank you for your attendance.
Thank you.